I rise today to speak in favor of S2244, the Terrorism Risk Insurance Program Reauthorization Act, or TRIA. As a co-sponsor of this bill, I recognize Senator Schumer, Senator Kirk, Senator Heller, and others for helping to put this bipartisan piece of legislation together. Chairman Johnson and his staff also deserve a great amount of thanks for their strong efforts in moving this bill forward. Working together, we developed a balanced bipartisan product that was literally unanimously supported in the Banking Committee, 22-0. This bill that we have put together allows the private insurance industry to absorb and cover the losses of all but the largest acts of terror, ones in which the federal government would likely be forced to step in any event if the program were not there. Taxpayer protections have been increased in this reauthorization by moving more of the responsibility for losses on to private insurers. For those who are not familiar with the program, TRIA was initially passed as a response to the unavailability of terrorism insurance in the wake of 9/11. The private market had already retreated in response to those terrorist attacks. It was then thought that a temporary program would allow the market time to develop products that would allow policyholders to protect themselves from terrorism losses. More than a decade after the tragic events of 9/11, the temporary inability to insure against terrorism has abated, and private capital is better positioned to take on more exposure to terrorism. When the Banking Committee held its first hearing on TRIA's reauthorization last year, we discussed the ability of the private insurance market to step in to provide terrorism insurance if the TRIA program expired. In that hearing and in subsequent meetings with providers, policyholders, and stakeholders, we recognized on a bipartisan basis that the continued difficulties associated with providing terrorism insurance required that we look again at extending the act. Terrorism is difficult to predict. Therefore, the ability to develop products to insure against terrorism is very difficult to do. The size, severity, and frequency of attacks are hard to model. Also, attacks may be highly correlated, making it difficult for private insurers to diversify their risk. Having TRIA in place was determined to be important. But if the market is too heavily reliant on federal support, we may deter private companies from coming up with cost-effective solutions. That's why, instead of a straight reauthorization, I and others pushed for reforms to maintain the program and increase protections for taxpayers. In order to do that, we examined each of the policy levers in the program. The bill marked up by the Banking Committee would increase the insurance industry's aggregate retention level and the company co-insurance levels. As the program stands today, the federal government would recoup any TRIA payments that it makes, up to $27.5 billion, through post-event payments. This industry retention level allows the taxpayer to recover TRIA payments through an industry-wide assessment on property casualty policies. This aspect of the bill was last changed in the 2005 reauthorization. The bill before us today increases that recoupment level by $2 billion a year to an overall level of $37.5 billion, an additional $10 billion. This is a significant reduction in the potential exposure and cost to taxpayers. In addition, the bill increases the company co-insurance level from 15% to 20% over 5 years. This means that before the backstop is reached, each company will take on a greater portion of the losses above their deductible. In order to get more private capital in the marketplace, Senator Flake has an amendment to create an advisory committee to promote the creation and development of private sector risk-sharing mechanisms. I support the addition of the Flake Amendment and believe the advisory committee will find private sector solutions that will allow us to further decrease the program in future reauthorizations. Before I conclude, Mr. President, I would also like to note that I have a handful of letters in my possession here from groups across this country strongly supporting and encouraging that we adopt this legislation. The United States Chamber of Commerce has listed this as a key vote. The Coalition to Insure Against Terrorism, which represents dozens and dozens of the financial sector interests across this country, recommend and encourage that we support this legislation. The Mortgage Bankers Association, the National Association of Insurance Companies, the Property Casualty Insurers, the National Apartment Association, the National Multifamily Housing Council, and the American Builders Conference. Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, these are just a sampling of those letters that we have received from interests across the nation who support this legislation, and I would ask unanimous consent at this time that these letters be placed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, getting terrorism risk insurance right is important in order to protect taxpayers and to limit economic and physical impacts of any future terrorist attacks on the United States. This bill will help us maintain a properly balanced terrorism risk insurance program that increases the nation's economic resilience to terrorism. Again, I thank Chairman Johnson and Senators Schumer, Kirk, and Heller for their partnership in bringing this bill forward and encourage its adoption. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.